China's investments in renewables helped drive astonishing price drops across the industry, leading to record levels of new wind and solar installations all over the world in recent years. Last year, wind and solar generated more than 10% of the world's electricity. Still, renewables only make up a tiny fraction of China's energy mix today.
Within that, if you look at power generation, it's overwhelmingly coal, roughly 60%. Wind, biomass, solar remain a much smaller fraction.
There was pressure building up on China for quite a few years that China needs to do more to cut emissions.
The country's reliance on fossil fuels is also a hindrance to its own growth and the well-being of its citizens.
China is not energy secure. It has a massive import bill for things like oil and gas. It has a long-standing pollution problem.
As the world starts to turn away from fossil fuels, China is positioning itself as the king of clean energy, not only transforming its own energy system, but also building a supply chain that could leave the world uncomfortably dependent on China for its energy needs.
China has really expanded its grip, so it's the processing, it's the manufacturing, it's all the way down to your EVs and your battery packs. How the West deals with that, they're going to have to be a bit creative.
What China plans to accomplish by 2030 could determine the shape of the global energy system of the future. At the end of the last century, China was on the cusp of an economic revolution.
China has always been known for its massive population size. It's home to 1.41 billion people. That means nearly 1 out of every 5 human beings on Earth lives in China. But now that number's shrinking for the first time since 1961.
China's population has declined for the first time in more than 60 years. According to numbers released Tuesday by China's National Bureau of Statistics, the population in 2022 was just over 1.4 billion, a drop of 850,000 from a year prior.
So the recent news that Chinese population has declined for the first time in decades.
In 1990, its GDP was only 6% that of the US, and its energy use was only 34%. But the economic reforms of the 80s and 90s started the process of privatizing industry and opening up to trade with the rest of the world. By the time it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, China was well on its way to becoming the world's factory, with booming energy needs to match.
The history of it is really dramatic, I think, just the condensation. Really, China is doing Industrial Revolution, 100 years after that, all of that in a very concentrated period of time. So what we saw is obviously dramatic change in terms of energy consumption, and there were power crunches in the early years where really the system was still trying to cope. Dramatic addition of coal-fired plants in particular to deal with that. From a climate perspective, the position was, well, you had your turn, now it's our turn. When you were growing, you as the West, there was no question of what carbon was doing. You did whatever you wanted, now it's our turn. That really changed in 2008, 2009, and that coincides with an awareness of air pollution.
In Beijing, which is facing another smoggy day, some environmentalists say it is the worst air on record.
Beijing was famously the most polluted city in the world for almost a decade.
In many ways, it is a big deal because it marks the end of this era of rapid growth and of cheap labor.
If the labor costs in China are no longer cheaper than other countries, China will lose its comparative advantage in manufacturing goods for the rest of the world.
Consequently, your prices of your iPhones, the prices of your cars, and many of these things are going to rise. And so the global consumer is going to feel what's happening. So what's happening in the bedrooms in China is actually affecting what's happening in the rest of the world.
China has been implemented this one-child policy for 35 years, from 1980 to 2015. The reason for this is back in 1980, the Chinese government observed or predicted that in the future, China's population growth rate will be so high. And then there will be the famine problem, then the agricultural production will not meet the people's wants and needs.
Many couples therefore chose to only have a son when restricted to just a one-child household. So consequently, after 30-something years, what you do have is a huge situation of missing women and surplus bachelors, something like 30 million surplus men who cannot find brides. That obviously has a lot of consequences for how do you make future babies for China, right? No women, that's a big problem. It caused the population to become too male, too old, and too few.
Reasons why the younger generation decide not to respond to the policy changes. Number one is the sheer cost of living. Just an ordinary city, if you buy property, you're looking at 30 years of commitment to pay off your mortgage. So this is a huge burden. In rural China, things are slightly different because housing is cheap. However, education is a problem. And if you want to send your kids to secondary schools or universities, you must leave your village. You can imagine then boarding costs, all the fees, this all build up.
Although the government relaxed this one-child policy to even three-child policy, but still we did not observe much effect out of it. One reason is COVID recently, especially for the year 2022. Because 2022, China still implemented this very stringent zero COVID policy. So most of people live in a very extremely inconvenient life. And many people got laid off because of this long time no show at work. That's why the birth rate in the year 2022 is very low.
So from the domestic perspective, the real estate market, which was booming for the last 30 years, your first generation of homeowners coming in, is now stalled, partly as a result of COVID, but also partly as a result of a housing crisis, and also partly because of the population growth slowing down. That's a long-term economic outlook that it's not helpful.
Aging is catching up in China. It actually affects the quality of population, and they are not as productive as young generation.
The aging population can make the government spend a lot of money on the welfare expenditure, right? They pay more money for the social securities, Medicaid, Medicare, and etc. And also population shrinks. That means taxpayers shrinks. So lower amount of taxpayers indicate a lower tax revenue and then higher government expenditure. So the government budget deficit will be the result.
Especially the last 25 years, China has embedded itself into global supply chains. And so we felt that very acutely, right, out of the COVID pandemic, particularly as vaccines were rolled out and consumer spending boomed. There were bottlenecks at ports. There were semiconductor chip shortages as inputs to automobiles. And so the integrated success of globalization has now become a threat to the resilience of global supply chains.
Now, China had for a long time been a manufacturing-based economy. So the source of cheap labor was very helpful to grow. And that's why very many of the world's factories relocated there. That's why it became the world's manufacturing floor. That's why your iPhones and your cars and your solar panels are all made in China. And that's why we've all paid relatively cheaper costs for it.
Unlimited supply of cheap labor from rural China is the engine of China's exports. Now, if you switch that off, China's cheap labor-based manufacturers will soon kind of a decline, and this will cause some kind of famine in goods. Certain things you can get very cheaply, not anymore. Cheap goods made in China, that part is over.
India is poised to dominate the global economy for the rest of this century. Why? Because its population will overtake China this year in 2023. And in the next few years, its working age population will become the largest in the world. Now, India still has demographics so that it will continue to grow and add population in the subsequent decades.
Indians are young. The average age is under 30. It's really a vibrant, young, educated workforce. I won't be surprised in the next decade India will be the workshop of the world.
Population is only going to be one dimension of this. We have to think about infrastructure, about gender roles, gender equality, about the nature of the economy. And in that sense, of course, there are still fundamental differences between China and India. And I think in many ways, India still has a lot of ground to gain.
Just because you have plenty of young workers doesn't mean you have the roads or the factories or the financing or the logistics to take advantage of all those things and really make it come together. So yeah, there's not that expectation at all.
This population decline and this process of aging is almost irreversible. We can try to slow it down a little bit through increasing fertility rates, but that's not really the solution to anything because, of course, babies don't work, babies don't pay tax. And so what we need to do is tackle some of the challenges of today, and that will require things like reforming the pension system, making sure that their health and social welfare systems are more adequate, but then also ensuring that China can do more with a smaller population, involve increasing productivity, maybe reforming the education system and so on.
Suppose if the labor supply reaches a critically low point, the Chinese government might consider importing cheaper labors from other countries to lower the cost of production and to maintain its comparative advantage of its domestic products. And this will bring about even more benefits to other countries with cheaper labor.
Foreign companies, foreign governments are aware that things are going in one direction in China at the moment.
A lot of companies are going to rethink their whole business model, whether they would place any manufacturing or resourcing outside of China, whether they would be looking at other sources of consumption growth.
The damage has been done. Nothing you can do about it. You just have to minimize the damage in the future.
China's appetite for energy is enormous. The country consumes about a quarter of the world's energy supply, 35% more than the US annually. Its energy needs have more than tripled since the year 2000. That consumption has helped to fuel astonishing growth, but it's come at a cost. All this has led the world's biggest polluter to take steps towards a radical transformation.
President Xi Jinping outlined his plans to make China carbon neutral by 2060.
COVID-19 reminds us that humankind should launch a green revolution and move faster to create a green way of development.
Much of the fossil fuel consumption, for example, oil and natural gas, will have to be imported. And that's something China wanted to walk away from. So starting about 2010, China committed to increase its deployment of renewables.
China, like many other places in the world, was faced with initially very non-competitive, on a cost basis, economics for solar projects, for wind projects, and being able to subsidize the manufacture of the key components, ensuring the power that they sell has an attractive rate. All of these things China has done very, very well. You push the market into existence, and then you're able to pull back with some of the policy mandates because now it just makes good economic sense.
China's decarbonization plan ramps up gradually, with fossil fuel emissions increasing for a few years before peaking in 2030. From there, they've given themselves another 3 decades to get to net zero, with 80% of energy coming from carbon-free sources by 2060. Getting there will be a massive undertaking, and it starts with renewable megaprojects on a scale seen nowhere else on Earth.
特殊性，因为建光伏电站它有2个首要条件，一个是有这个充足的这个太阳能光照资源，我们这个青海地区的光照资源在中国来说，在全国是排第2名。另外一个条件就有一个大型的这种荒漠化的土地，我们可以用这原来这些土地去建这个光伏电站，但是就是说有这2个资源是必不可少的。
In that facility, they have a hydro dam. They've got a massive solar build-up, and they're adding wind installations as well. When all of that is up and running, it's going to be producing nearly 20 gigawatts of energy. It's enough to cover the power needs at any given time for Israel, for example.
By 2030, China plans to scale up to 1.2 terawatts of wind and solar capacity, enough to meet all of the US's electricity needs today. But it's not enough just to generate that power. Getting the power where it needs to go is a mega project in itself.
它是从这个，因为青海当地是没有特别多的这个大型的这个工业企业，然后不需要这么多的电力，所以说我们需要把我们当地生产这些电力输送到中国的。
In order to ship all that electricity, China has basically built this huge network of ultra-high voltage power lines, and they're designed to get all of this energy from the west to where it's needed in the population and industrial centres of the east.
Power lines might seem like a mundane piece of infrastructure, but they're actually a crucial piece of the decarbonisation puzzle. A conventional AC power cable loses a lot of electricity over the course of hundreds of miles, hence the need for these specialised direct current lines.
There are only 2 countries in the world where these cables are operating, China and Brazil. Brazil has 2 of those cables, China has 25.
By far and away, China is absolutely the leader on this. And the amount of money that you're talking about, I mean, it's hundreds of billions of dollars that they're going to be spending on this in coming decades.
The idea of firm clean power is that you're able to generate carbon-free electricity when you want it, rather than relying on when the sun shines or the wind blows.
In most countries, the nuclear industry is struggling, facing huge upfront costs, regulatory hurdles, and negative public opinion. Still, it is a carbon-free source of reliable power, and many environmental advocates see it as a key to the green transition, as does China's leadership.
That still leaves the difficult economics of nuclear, the high upfront cost of building new reactors. Here too, China may have unique advantages.
One thing that we all know China really excels at doing is building huge infrastructure quickly. After decades of building bridges and skyscrapers and high-speed rail and ultra-high voltage lines, like every supermassive industrial project that China has built, that know-how goes into also building nuclear power plants. When you build projects consistently on schedule and on budget, you actually get to realize the benefits that were imagined back when the project was being planned, like stable, low-cost electricity at a certain rate, at a certain production cost.
China's efforts to decarbonise are likely to have many positive effects on its domestic energy supply. But that's not the only reason China has gone all in on clean energy. That dependence on China has lately been a source of strain. Last year, COVID-related production issues in China caused the price of solar panels to rise for the first time in decades. And some companies have pledged to take their business elsewhere due to reports of human rights abuses in the majority Uyghur province of Xinjiang, which produces most of the world's polysilicon, a key material in the manufacturing of solar panels.
Obviously, there have been accusations in the West that the Uyghurs are subject to forced labour. The industry and the Chinese government have denied this.
Some in the West are also concerned about China's dominance over the materials needed to make lithium-ion batteries. Cobalt, for example, is a scarce mineral produced mainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where China has bought up most of the supply. The Congolese government has recently pushed back against those efforts, alleging poor working conditions and unpaid debts by a Chinese mining company. But the majority of cobalt-producing mines there are still at least part Chinese-owned.
My instinct is that these things are not done for a nefarious purpose, right? To dominate the supply chain in a way that is disadvantageous to another country, but you know that the primary consideration is what is good for China. I mean, remember, we're coming from a period of not so long ago, late 90s, early 2000s, when China had rolling blackouts all the time. And we've got all this investment into making sure it can't happen again. From the way people talk about it here, they believe in the mission, and the mission is stable, secure energy for the Chinese people.
Even China's world-leading investments in carbon-free energy may not get them to their targets on time. But Beijing has recognized that the economic, political, and environmental rationales for clean energy now vastly outweigh the costs.
When it comes to the 2060 neutrality target, obviously China's a long way off. And it's a huge, huge audacious target. The people that are the top leaders that are planning it out right now, they probably won't even be around to see it, right? Will they make it? I don't know. It's a huge, huge goal, but they believe they're going to make it. What I can tell you is they're certainly going to try, and they're certainly going to spend a lot of money trying to get there.